First of all, let me ask you, Mr. Hutchinson, where do you reside right now?
I currently reside in Kuala Lumpor, Malaysia, in Southeast Asia.
How in the world did you get to Malaysia? That is the question. As you heard in the beginning of this segment, Carl Hutchinson is a retired engineer living in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. But you have to hear the rest of his story. He has worked and traveled extensively in the Middle East, the Far East, and he has had a very active career in engineering. But now, you have to hear how he got to where he is. And so this conversation is going to show us how from humble beginnings you can do great things. So check out this interview. You need to watch all of it here on Conversations with Hutch. All right, y'all, we have an interesting edition today. And I'm honored to have with me Carl Hutchinson. Now, if you're wondering, and if you hear that marvelous last name, yes, we are cousins. Matter of fact, we're first cousins, but that is not why he's with me today, because I have a lot of cousins. But you really need to hear this story, and you need to hear this story in its entirety. So don't do what some of y'all do and come into YouTube for a few minutes and then log off, log back on. You need to hear this whole story. First of all, let me ask you, Mr. Hutchinson, where do you reside right now?
I currently reside in Kuala Lumpor, Malaysia, in Southeast Asia.
How in the world did you get to Malaysia? That is the question.
It's a question which has a protracted answer, because I've been traveling since the mid-70s. And this has been my final destination. Not final, I'm still alive.
We got you.
Since 1994. So Malaysia has been my base. Not the only place I've lived in Southeast Asia, just the base that I've used because of its easy living, low cost of living, and up until recently, low density in terms of traffic on the roads.
Okay, that's a good answer. Well, for those of you who are watching, the rest of our time, we're going to spend unpacking his answer. Well, first of all, let's go all the way to the beginning. You were born in Jamaica, correct?
Yes, I was born in Jamaica in 1947.
Okay. And then you left Jamaica and went to the UK when? You were about how old?
Basically, I left Jamaica at the age of 11 and went to join my mother. But the story really starts in that I was born in 1947, and my father, your uncle, died when I was 8 months old. So that left my mother with 5 children at the age of 29 and with no male support.
And
which
so
res-
basically, go ahead.
yeah,
I'm sorry.
which resulted in the family being split up because my mother could not cope on her own. So my two elder sisters, Cynthia and Joy, were taken and raised by my grandparents in Kingston. And my third and fourth brother and sister were taken to St. Thomas, where they lived with my father's best friend in the case of my brother, and my maternal grandmother's family in the case of my third sister.
And so for those of you who are watching, there's some of you who are not Jamaican and you're wondering where St. Thomas is. Roughly, give or take a few miles, give or take a distance, roughly about maybe 50 to 60 miles to the east of Kingston in the country. That's where they were taken, basically where a lot of our paternal and some of our maternal relatives have lived. So that's where they were, correct?
Yes. I forgot to add that I, at 8 months old, stayed with my mother.
Okay.
Mm.
And so basically, from what you're saying and from my deducing, of course, knowing something about the family, eventually all of you were somewhat reunited in England, in London, correct?
Yes, typically in during the migration, the Great Migration of the West Indian labor force after the Second World War, the parents went to England to look for and make a better life for themselves and their children. And this resulted in my mother going to England on her own to try and earn enough money to be able to bring my eldest sisters to the UK so that they also could work and earn. This is a typical story of the West Indian families going to England, working very hard, and then one by one bringing up the kids in order of age, because the older the kids were, they could earn and contribute to the family's coffers, so that gradually they brought up all the children with the mistaken idea that they could get a first-class education.
I laugh, but you know why. Well, let me
Yeah.
interject here. For those of you who are watching, just so you can understand, now we are first cousins. His father was older than my father. They were brothers. Okay, so his siblings, all of them are older than me, but we are first cousins. So we have like about a 15-year range in there. So now here's what happened.
Hold on. You say 15-year range. 15-year range
In
between
age.
you and me or my siblings?
I'm talking about all of us. About
No,
15.
no. Not 15 years.
It's more than that.
I'm currently 75.
All right. Well, yeah, I'm
My
61.
eldest, I'm the youngest of the five.
You're right. Okay.
And my eldest sister was 10 years older than I was.
Okay. So you're talking about 25-year range, roughly.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, I stand corrected, but here's what I don't want y'all to miss. You had a great migration here in the United States. of persons leaving the South, going north. And depending on where you were in the South, you hit the East Coast. You were, if you were where I am in Tennessee, a lot of people in Mississippi, a lot of people went straight north. So that's St. Louis, that's Chicago. If you're down in Louisiana, you went to the West Coast. You hit Oakland, you hit LA. But now with Jamaicans, it's a little different. We had the same migration, but we had it basically to two places. A primary migration was to England, and you had what's called the Windrush generation. There have been Black people in Europe for millennia, but in numbers, Black people showed up with the Windrush. It was a boat that docked in London in 1948. And anybody that arrived in England, I think from 48 to about 64, they said they were part of the Windrush generation, that first wave of immigrants. So I have family on both sides that are part of that generation, and some of whom, especially like some of the ones that are closely related to Carl and I, they were among the first of the first that were part of that whole movement. And as he described, usually the adults, the parents went first, got the older children to come, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, I am part of a wave that went to New York. So he and his parents went to London. My parents went to New York. I was born in New York. You got a third, a smaller wave that went to Toronto. And now you have waves that go to Atlanta, you go to Miami. So I'm just trying to show y'all how the movements have taken place. So you're kind of hearing a bit of history played out actually in a family tree. All right, I'm sorry. I just want to add that little piece of history because a lot of people don't realize, Carl, that just as you had a migration from the South going north and going to all those cities, you had a parallel migration leaving the island, going to the various places in the north. So certain northern cities here in America, have a sizable Caribbean population. Just as in London, you have a very sizable Caribbean population. And then you also have African migration. People that have left the colonies to go to London and places like that. But let me ask you this question. Go ahead.
There's one thing in terms of, you say London, but London was by not the major destination. The major destination was further north, where, again, one of our uncles ended up in Birmingham. Now, that was a far larger population of Caribbean and especially Jamaicans from the Windrush generation. They went to the factories, the manufacturing heartland of the UK, which was basically Birmingham and Manchester.
Well, that's a good piece of history to know. For those of you who are watching this from the US, think of people going to Detroit, going to the Ford plants, going to the Chrysler plants, going to GM. Similar, going to Pittsburgh, going to other places, and even some who didn't leave, let's say, for example, Alabama, but going to our Birmingham in Alabama, at factories, etc. So there's a lot of parallels. Well, let me ask you this question. In terms of that, and see, with the Windrush generation, understand this, that when those persons left the Caribbean, they were British citizens. So they didn't have to get a passport. They were British citizens. But however, some hiccups took place since then because a lot of those countries became independent. And so I guess what I'm asking you to do, and you kind of alluded to it when you talked about education, kind of give us a glimpse as to what that actually looked like for those who, were part of that generation who made it to the British Isles? What did that look like? What did they encounter?
This brings me back to the education standards that existed in the Caribbean. What you had in the Caribbean was a class being educated by the British primarily to take up the lower positions within the colonial administration. For instance, clerks, policemen, artisans. So they were well educated. They were educated to a level greater than that of the lower classes of British people in the UK. Like you had accountants, you had engineers or technicians, highly skilled technicians, who emigrated thinking that they would go to the UK and be able to take advantage of their skill level to earn lot greater wages. But in effect, what happened, because of skin color, what you had was a situation where, and this is a phrase that could be found on many doors of when West Indians went to look for rooms to rent. No dogs, no blacks, no Irish. So that was the situation back in the 50s and through the 60s. What that did was force us to start buying our own properties. In effect, they gave us an opportunity which we didn't think about, because if we couldn't get rooms to rent, we had to buy. So that put firmly on the first step of the ladder to build wealth. So there's a lot of people in the UK, black people, who started the trend to owning their own house. Prior to the 60s, the 50s and 60s, no lower level laborers or factory workers owned their own property. They all rented from the landed gentry.
And that's interesting that you say that, because my father went through something similar here. Now, of course, my mother was sponsored by a hospital as a registered nurse and midwife. But my father, he had 24 years of experience with the leading newspaper in the Caribbean, which was the Daily Gleaner. He had experience. To explain it a different way, he had as much experience as the white people who had those positions. But because of the color of his skin, he had to transfer and do something else in printing. And of course, printing was not friendly to Black people at that time. So he had spot work, would work here, would work there, all because of his skin color, not his qualifications. Matter of fact, I came across a letter recently, his recommendation letters from both his union and from both the Gleaner, saying that you would do well to hire this man. We couldn't make headway for the reasons that you cite. So same thing happened on both sides of the water. They may have looked a little different, but they were similar. So now here's what I want to know. You get to England, you and your siblings get to England. So now, how did you decide upon your profession, and what was that like taking that road to get there? Because first of all, were there a lot of Black people doing what you eventually did back then? Or was it unique to, to you and just a few? So I'm just interested in that part of it.
My career path started basically at school. But I have to go back and explain my schooling. When I first came to England at the age of 11, that is a transition point between junior school and senior school. I don't know how it works in the States.
That'll be junior high school and high school. Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. So what happened was as soon as I came to England, I had to take a test to ascertain my education level. During that, after I took the test and the assessment was made, I was recommended for a grammar school. And a grammar school in England is basically streaming children to be in the administrative classes, not the bus driver or the factory worker. But very, very interesting. There were no places in the school to accept a Black child.
Mm.
So I was then streamed and sent to what's known in England as a secondary modern, basically where they teach you as little as possible and prepare you to be a bus driver, a sanitation worker, a factory worker, an artisan.
Mm.
There were 6 classes in my entrance year to that school. And bearing in mind I was recommended for a grammar school, I was put in the lowest class. They graded them 1-1 to 1-6. I was put in 1-6. After the first 2 terms, I had been elevated 4 classes, and I was still top of the class.
Mm.
So there was obviously something wrong, because after the 4th year, strangely enough, there was 1 Black teacher in the school. And I actually mentioned it to her when I was in the 4th year. And she said, just a throwaway comment, "So you were the kid they had that row about in the staff room?"
Mm. Mm.
So, basically, if you were bright, and it still goes on today, if you show any degree of aptitude, the system is set up to sideline you.
Wow.
You get thrown out of class for being too clever, i.e., arguing with the teacher. And normally these teachers are not the best on the block. So you tend to find that smart kids are normally more attuned and brighter than the teacher that's trying to teach them. And this really creates a problem, because when they say, "No, miss," or "No, sir," that's wrong. It's X, Y, and Z, not Z, T, U. you get thrown out the class and sent to the headmaster for being insubordinate.
Mm-hmm. So how did you get through that? Because obviously you didn't wind up being a bus driver. So some kind of way you navigated that territory.
Well, my aspirations were greater than my achievements, because I wanted to be an Air Force pilot,
Okay.
and basically what you had, and I set myself a course. One of the things that you need to be aware of is that going back to being brought up to England in the train of the eldest, then it goes down the chain. The parents of kids brought to England had to work, and they had to work long and hard hours. So they didn't have the time to raise their kids as kids should be raised. Mm-hmm. So each child was left to fend for itself. Mm-hmm. So you had to choose your path, or the path that was chosen for you was, as I said, bus driver, train driver, a street sanitation worker, whatever. And it didn't just apply to the blacks. Let me state that point. If you're in that lower level income strata, it applied to whites as well as blacks. So you were being trained in these schools, as I said prior, to be either a sanitation worker, a bus driver, a train driver, or a factory worker. And that was it. So the few that escaped that path were very, very clever. Right? So basically, my trajectory was to join the Royal Air Force and become a pilot. Now, to achieve this, at the age of 14, I joined the what's known as the ATC, the Air Training Corps, which was basically like the upgraded scouts, if you like.
Like ROTC here in the States.
Yes.
Okay.
Where you go to weekly training sessions, meetings, you learn to handle weapons, and once a month you'd go to one of the Air Force bases and do fighter pilot training, glider pilot training and licensing. So all of this sort of, I was preparing myself for joining the Air Force. And this is all based on my own trajectory. My parents didn't know what I was doing. My teachers at school, we had career masters who didn't know or wasn't prepared to help the people under their care, let alone Black people. So it wasn't just it was prejudice, but it was total prejudice, not especially against the Blacks and the Irish, because the Irish were considered the Blacks of Europe.
So the Blacks and the Blacks were lumped together.
Yes. Yeah. So basically, after that, I went to the Air Force recruiting establishment when I was preparing for my examinations, what exams I was taking. I made sure they were in line with the requirements to join and become a pilot. So when I went to the recruiting office, I said, yes, I'm here. I want to join up. I want to be a pilot. I've got the qualifications required to start from the bottom. They said, oh, the qualifications have changed. You need to do this, this, and this on top of what you've already done. So basically, they were cutting me off at the knees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
So
that's been used across the board. Every time when we get to a certain place, the rules change. But keep going.
Yeah. So funny, one thing I decided was I was never going to work in a factory or drive a bus or lift a dustbin. So I determined I was going to get some form of office job, preferably engineering based.
You have to come back. You just have to come back and watch part 2 of this marvelous interview. It is interesting so far, and then you're going to hear some other pieces as to how he got to where he is. So come back, subscribe, share. We'll see you soon.